This is a GRDC podcast.
You want to nail those snails in the crop? Well, naming those snails is the first step. Hi, I'm Prue Adams, hello, and I'm on a very windy day in Yorke Peninsula on the snail trail and speaking with Dr Kym Perry, Research Fellow in Entomology at the University of Adelaide. So Kym, let's be really specific up front and tell me about the four main snail culprits in crops.
Sure. So we have 4 introduced snails in Australia. They've all come from the Mediterranean region in Europe around about 100 years ago. We've got 2 round snails, the vineyard snail Cernuella virgata and the white Italian snail Theba pisana, and 2 conical snails, the conical snail Cochlicella acuta and the small pointed snail Cochlicella barbara.
I'm going to let you keep on saying the names of them because I won't remember all of them. But if we can go through sort of one by one and just tell me how would growers identify them?
Well, it's fairly simple with the round snails. First of all, they're round, but the key difference is in the shape of the hole on the underside of the snail. That's referred to as the umbilicus. In the vineyard snail, that hole is quite large and open like a donut. In the white Italian snail, it's sort of partly closed over, and generally it's quite easy to tell. Sometimes you can be a little bit uncertain, and if that's the case, you can take a hand lens, and if you look really closely at the shell, the white Italian snail will have very faint cross etchings on it, which you can just see under a hand lens if you're good with it, whereas the vineyard snail doesn't. It just has straight scratch markings on it. So that's the trick for the round snails. For the conical snails, the conical snail Cochlicella acuta is quite long and skinny and pointed, and it's generally quite easy to tell. The small pointed snail is a broader snail, a bit shorter and stubbier. So yeah, once you've got your eye in, it's quite easy to tell them apart.
I've noticed you today being able to spot them from almost 100 paces and know exactly which one's which and whether they're alive or dead. One of the things I have noticed today is that the colours vary a bit on them too, don't they? Should growers be looking out for different colours or different banding?
Very good observation. The colours are not a great guide because there can be a lot of variation in the colour of the shell within each species, and a lot of that is driven by environmental conditions. So how much sun exposure they've had, what they've fed on in growing their shell, and you can see a wide range of colour patterns which can be quite beautiful but not super helpful for identification. Although the strongly banded snails are generally quite easy to tell. So for the 2 rounds, for example, the vineyard snail has a very distinct brown banding colour, which is sort of unbroken and continuous. The white Italian snail has more of a broken banding pattern around the shell. And once you've seen a few of these, you'll very easily spot that. And once again, for the conical snails, I would say the small pointed snail tends to be a little darker in colour and it tends to blend in with the soil a little bit more, whereas the conical snail can be paler and a bit more of a white colour. But like you say, it can vary quite widely.
So if growers are looking for them, where are they going to find them? And I know it varies depending what time of the year it is and what stage the crop is at that stage.
Absolutely, yeah. The distribution of these things changes across the year along with the weather and their behaviour. And so, for example, in the summer, they will go into aestivation, which is like a resting state, which enables them to escape and survive the hot, dry conditions in summer. And at that time, they usually clump together. You often find them together up on things like fence posts or underneath things like logs and rocks and grass tussocks and weeds and things like that. And so in summer, the distribution is much more aggregated and the snails can be more obvious in some areas. Whereas in the wintertime, when it's wet and the soil is moist, the snails are all down on the ground and moving around doing their thing. So feeding, mating, laying eggs and that sort of thing. And in fact, looking around now, here we are in winter, and it looks like there's no snails to be seen until you take a really close look and you see actually they're there, they're just all down on the ground.
Yeah, that's the thing. You can walk into a paddock, into any crop, and you really wouldn't know from the outside. It's not until you get your eye in that you go, actually, there are an awful lot. And how many are there? Because you were telling me before how many you might find in a 30 by 30 centimetre square.
Sure, as we were looking around on the edge of this crop earlier today, we scratched around the weeds and in the trash and stubble, and sure enough, there were plenty of conical snails just sitting there. But if you actually consider how many there are per unit area, so a standard quadrat in entomology is around 30 centimetres by 30 centimetres square, which is around 1/10 of a square metre. And it's very common to find 100 live snails in that area. Multiply that by 10, you're actually looking at a density of 1,000 per square metre, and in pasture phases, we commonly see these sorts of densities, and it can be easily forgotten that the snails are there in the pasture. And if you're not managing those snails in the pasture phase, then in the following year, you can have quite a few more that have managed to breed up in that pasture. So the snails have a capacity to reach phenomenal densities.
Because they breed pretty well, don't they?
Absolutely they do, yeah. And the interesting thing is these animals are hermaphrodites, so they function both as males and females. They still need to mate with each other, but then both individuals will produce offspring, which is just amazing. So for the conical snails, a breeding pair of snails can produce 300 or 400 eggs in their lifetime over a period of a couple of years. For the round snails, it's even more. They can produce upwards of 3,000 eggs in their lifetime. So, if you're trying to minimise juvenile snails, then you really need to be controlling those adults.
Geographically, where are they found? And is each type of snail found in a specific region, or is it more broad?
Very good question, and that's where the four species can differ somewhat. So it depends on which cropping region you're in as to which are the dominant snails in your area. And the other thing to consider is that the distributions of it are very patchy. So you can drive along a roadside and you can find snails quite thick on one side of the road and not even present on the other side of the road. So locally they can be quite patchy. But broadly, these are coastal species. So the coastal cropping areas are generally more prone to snails. In terms of the rounds, Theba pisana is a snail that prefers to live very close to the coast. Further inland,
Enough. I like living close to
Well,
the
who doesn't?
coast as well, exactly. They're Mediterranean after all.
the vineyard snail has a broader distribution. It can live further inland. Now, the two snails can sometimes be found together, but what we see is that in the coastal areas, if there's heaps and heaps of Theba pisana in a local area, it tends to outcompete the vineyard snail. So it will be all white Italian snail if there are lots of them. But if the numbers are lower, they can both coexist. For the conical snails, again, the conical snail, the long skinny one, is more coastal. The small pointed snail can have a broader distribution and occur, over a wider range. The other thing that's important is soil chemistry. So these animals thrive on calcium. They need it for their shell growth and for their reproduction. And so soils with high calcium content are much more favourable for snails. So those soils with free calcium have a lot more snails, and even within a paddock, that can vary quite a lot. So areas with more calcium will generally have more snails. The small pointed snail can survive on more acidic soils than some of the other snails.
There'd be a lot of calcium in the soil around this part of the world, I'd imagine, is there?
There is, and that's partly why,
So this is Yorke Peninsula that we're on at the moment. And
yeah, there can be areas with lots of snails because of that, the limestone and the calcium content, but there are plenty of acid soils around here too, and you find that there just aren't the snail numbers on those soil types. Once you really start to think about soil and the amount of calcium in the environment, and you look at snail abundance patterns in relation to that, it really starts to make a lot of sense ecologically. It's like reading a book.
so why is it important to identify them?
To be honest, there's not a huge difference in the management of the round snails, so whether you've got one or the other doesn't make a huge difference. I would say Theba pisana is a snail that becomes a bit more active more quickly after summer, and that's one consideration. For the conical snails, once again, the two conicals the management's fairly similar, I would say. But if you've got both rounds and conicals in an area, then you do have to think about that because they do have some differences in their ecology and behaviour. One key difference is that the conicals will prefer to hide in refuges. They're much more cryptic. Whereas the rounds, they'll also hide, but they'll also be up on things, right? So when the weather conditions are suitable, the round snails become active quite quickly. And this is really evident at the end of summer. So during summer, when the snails rest, right at the end of that, when when more moisture comes in and the snails start to move and feed and start to think about breeding. The round snails are generally active earlier, and it can take a few weeks longer for the conical snails to really start to fire up. And that's important for management, because if you're baiting, you need to be baiting at the right time for both species. So it would be earlier for the rounds, and then probably a follow-up baiting for the conical snails.
Fantastic. So if growers wanted to find out more about the identification of snails, where should they go?
There are some great resources for growers which have been put out by GRDC. Of course, the Nail the Snails manual has a quick start guide in it and some very clear instructions on how to identify them. Otherwise, there'll be a video coming out
They will.
showing exactly what features you need to look at for the snails.
Thanks, Kym. That's fantastic information. And for more information, you can go to the description box on this podcast or online at grdc.com.au. I'm Prue Adams. This has been a GRDC podcast. Thanks for listening.